Good morning, Chicago. I'm Dr. Allison Arwady, Commissioner at the Chicago Department of Public Health. Today is Tuesday, October 12th, 2021. We're getting started just a couple minutes late because Tuesday is my Monday. We were off yesterday, but thank you for everybody who has joined us here today. As always, it's your chance to get your COVID questions answered. Some of you have been writing in with some questions about mental health and violence prevention and substance use, and actually I'm happy to start including some of those if people are interested. I might ask our behavioral health director to come on and talk some about that too, if that's something people are interested in hearing. But we do continue to get flooded with COVID questions, so that's what we'll be primarily focused on today. As always, you can put your questions directly into the box below. You can also use the hashtag AskDrArwady on either Facebook or Twitter, and we will be taking your questions live. So let's start with a look at our Chicago numbers. CHI.gov/COVID- is where you can go to see the Chicago-specific COVID numbers. And as we pull this up, we see a lot of green. Things continue to look pretty good here. We're averaging 352 cases per day. You see that's flat from a week ago. So we've seen, if you compare this alpha surge that we had in the early spring with this delta surge, you can see we've flattened out a little bit. I'm really happy it didn't get any higher at this point. And certainly we're still doing significantly better than nearly everywhere in the country. But at this point we are generally seeing flattening, but down just a little bit. We're averaging 23 hospitalizations a day. You can see that does continue to decline. 2 to 3 deaths a day, which is definitely declining. You can see we were averaging over 5 a week ago. About 5,900 vaccinations, which is good. That's up. And more than 20,000 tests every day, still the most we've been doing since the beginning of COVID. And in that context, our positivity is at 2.2% compared to 2.3% a week ago. So everything looking generally quite good. While we remain between 200 and 400 cases a day with a good positivity, which we've had, we're in what's considered a substantial risk for COVID. Over 400 is considered the high risk for COVID. That's how the CDC defines it. And during the Delta surge, the CDC has continued to recommend that jurisdictions that are at a substantial or high risk keep wearing those masks indoors. So a few of you have been writing in about the masks. There is still a state requirement to be wearing masks indoors at this time and while we remain in that substantial territory. So seeing some progress. I'd love to be able to take those masks off. And I think as we are able to hopefully see younger children start to get vaccinated, just probably less than a month from now, I think that will be a big step. And seeing how we do heading into the winter, of course, is the other piece. So I also wanted to show you just a couple of slides. So first of all, here again is just where those 4 main metrics are. We follow more behind the scenes, but the top one, our cases per day, you can see remains at that substantial level until we get back down under 200. But our positivity has been very good. It's remained in that lower transmission, lower risk level. Our hospital beds and our ICU beds both are back in that lower transmission risk, which is really, really good progress. Our case rates, every week we update this, remain significantly higher among unvaccinated versus fully vaccinated Chicagoans. And something is a little strange with this formatting here, but we'll post the slides online. And even some of you were asking, what about just during the Delta surge? So even just during the Delta surge, when it's been the longest since people have been vaccinated, it's the most contagious vaccine, unvaccinated Chicagoans have been more than twice as likely as vaccinated Chicagoans to be diagnosed with COVID-19. It is still by far, getting vaccinated, the most important thing you can do to limit your risk from COVID. And we see here, the red, these are unvaccinated Chicagoans. The blue are fully vaccinated Chicagoans. And as we've been seeing some decrease during this Delta surge, we're seeing that really smoothly among those who are fully vaccinated. Our hospitalization rates, again, just during Delta, unvaccinated Chicagoans more than 5 times as likely as vaccinated Chicagoans to be hospitalized with COVID. And then just during Delta, unvaccinated Chicagoans more than 8 times as likely as vaccinated vaccinated Chicagoans to die from COVID-19. And where we look at particular risk groups, especially people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, some of that older working age group, it's that disparity is much greater. So, as we mentioned a few weeks ago when we were breaking this down by age and race ethnicity, for people in their 50s and 60s, for example, who are Black and Latinx, the risk of dying if someone is unvaccinated versus fully vaccinated right here in Chicago, the risk was about 50 times as high. But for all comers, children, adults, everybody, more than 8 times more likely to die, which is the main reason. Some of you have been writing in saying, why do you continue to recommend vaccination? Shouldn't I count on my natural immunity? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is one of the main reasons that we still, unfortunately, where people are kind of taking their chances with getting COVID, we are seeing many, many, many more of them get hospitalized and die. A quick reminder on the Pfizer booster, people over 65 and people over 50 with underlying medical conditions should be getting that Pfizer booster if it's been 6 months since your second dose, and people who are over 18 with underlying medical conditions or who work in a higher risk setting also can receive that booster. Later this week, the 14th and the 15th, the FDA are going to be looking at some of the data to consider a Moderna booster and a J&J booster. So a lot of you have been writing in about that. We'll start to have some more information about that as soon as later this week. And I expect we'll have some guidance for you on boosters before the end of the month. And then October 26th, as a reminder, the FDA's advisory committee will start looking at the Pfizer data for 5 to 11-year-olds. And that is a different dose of the vaccine for those younger kids. It's a third of the dose that was used for the teenagers and the adults. Reminder, chicago.gov/flu is where you can go to see where you can get flu and COVID vaccines. We've been tagging this as the combo you don't want. This example for today, we're in the 48th ward, or we're at this church. On the 14th, we are at City Hall. You can get COVID vaccine. You can get your first and second dose of COVID vaccines. You can get Pfizer boosters, and you can get your flu shot, all, for example, at the City Hall clinic. You can register in advance or walk in. And if you go online, you can see all the places where you can get flu shots. And then we're doing a couple of larger events coming up on Saturdays, the 16th and then the 23rd, in partnership with our large city college sites. So at Wright College, Arturo Velasquez, and Kennedy King College, this coming Saturday, October 16th, we'll be offering flu, COVID primary vaccines, and Pfizer boosters. And then the next Saturday, we'll be at Daly College and Truman College. So I will be at Kennedy King College this Saturday getting my flu and my Pfizer booster. I also wanted to show a video from one of the new campaigns that we've launched. We've got a big focus on seniors, and not just seniors, but thinking about how Chicagoans all across this city are reaching out to help others get vaccinated. So there's a new campaign, and I want to ask the team if we can show that video now.
I was the first Black United States Marine in my county of Lauderdale County, Ripley, Tennessee. And they thought I wasn't gonna make it because I was too small. I was a Chicago firefighter for 29 years and 1 day. COVID, it was all over this world. Pandemic, that's what it means. Lost some very dear friends to COVID. That's why I called the hotline, to find out how I could save my friends.
I did work on a hotline, and I recognized that voice. I said, Mr. Taylor, do you know who this is on the other line? It's Cam.
How long have I been known Cameron? At least about 8 years old.
I lost my grandfather pretty young, and Mr. Taylor's just like my grandpa.
I appreciate that very much, man. You don't know what that makes me feel, man. You hit my heart, man.
When my fiance contracted COVID, I decided to help people get vaccinated because people like me, and even look like me, could go out and talk to people that would be scared to get it.
Oh, yes, I've convinced quite a few people to get theirs. Personal friends of mine. When we saved one, I used to fight fires with him because he almost lost his life.
And the first line of people that need that information in a time like this are seniors.
I feel so much safer having gotten the vaccine. It has given me the freedom that I had once upon a time that now I have again. Take care of yourself and your neighbors. I've been saving people all of my life, so why stop now?
That's our duty as Chicagoans.
And that is what Chicago is all about.
Back to you, Dr.
Great. So find available. They're on our website, particular if you go to chicago.gov/COVIDvax, there's a seniors page. And again, some of these are senior focused. I remain concerned, especially about Chicagoans over the age of 80 who have not yet gotten their primary vaccination series. Really high risk for hospitalization and death in that age group, and would encourage you to reach out if you know somebody over 65, or particularly over 80 who's not yet vaccinated. And we are going to be showing these stories on a lot of prime time here. So as you see on Good Morning America and Shark Tank and Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune and Magnum PI and Thursday Night Football and some of the early news. We've got a Spanish version that we're showing on Telemundo and Univision, hope you look out for these, and if you like them, please do share them and give us feedback on them. I also wanted to right off the bat, I'm seeing this question from Susie Greenberg on Twitter saying, if you've had COVID and test positive for antibodies, doesn't your natural immunity protect you? Do you still need to get vaccinated? And we've been getting versions of this question a lot, so I thought I would show you right off the bat a little bit of the data that I look at when I make the recommendations around getting vaccinated after getting COVID infection and recovering. So this is a study. The link is at the bottom if you want to take a look. Chen, C-H-E-N, is the primary author. And what this graph is showing, is the higher those little dots are, the higher the antibody level. Higher is more protective. It says anti-RBD IgG. That's one of the antibodies. And so on green here on the left, we have people who were tested who recovered from COVID and did not have a vaccine. So like Susie Greenberg's writing in, what you can see is that as we track across just on this left part where the green dots are, that gray line shows if you've had no exposure to COVID, no protection, no antibodies at all. 39 days after symptom onset, we can see these green dots show the high variability of the kinds of the level of antibodies that people were having, and that line shows kind of the average. And then you see that as time goes by, we do see some of those antibody levels dropping, but you definitely still have some antibodies generally. Not everybody does. You can see down at the bottom here, there are people who completely lose, don't have any antibodies after natural infection. And some of that we think has to do with how seriously ill people get, how old they may be, particularly people who are older. We worry about not having as much of an immune response or protection from COVID. So definitely you've got some level of protection, and I worry the most about people who have neither recovered from COVID nor had vaccine. But then in contrast, these are all on the same scale. So in the middle here, this purple group are people who both recovered from COVID and got the vaccine. And this is really the group over and over and over again in all the studies that I look at are by far the best protected. So you can see pre here on the left in the purple shows that yes, people did have some antibody level because they'd recovered from COVID before getting vaccinated. But after that, even that first dose of COVID, you can see their level of protection is much, much higher, and then it stays much higher. And we don't have anybody who's got a level below that gray line suggesting that they don't have really any protection. And this is why, people who are lucky enough to have recovered and get vaccinated, I think are in the best boat of anybody. Of course, there are some people in this group who continue to have some long-term problems, et cetera. But it's part of why I really encourage people, if you have recovered from COVID, not just to stay in that green group, but to get into the purple group, particularly with variants. And then on the right, we've got people who are vaccinated and never had COVID. So you can see in that right, they're all down at that that gray line. They don't have antibodies, of course, because they've not had exposure. And then with the first dose, you see, and this is specifically the mRNA vaccines, you see that there is some level of protection, similar maybe to what we're seeing after people have recovered from COVID before getting vaccinated. And then after that second dose, you see it gets much higher and then does start to fall back off, which is part of why 6 months after the vaccine, we're starting to recommend that booster dose. So really, you do have some level of protection for sure if you've recovered, but there's no antibody level that you can check that tells you at an individual level that you specifically are protected against COVID. The scientists are working on that, but at a population level, this is really what we're looking at. And this, I'm not going to take too much more time here, and I refer you, this is just one example of a paper, but this is the same, showing for a couple of the different kinds of antibodies here. Again, green are people who recovered from COVID. Black are people who did not have COVID but got vaccinated. And then purple are people who had both. And higher is a higher antibody level. So you can see on the upper left here in C really how much better that protection stays for people who had both. And then D, E, F, G, H, I are showing with the different variants. And so you see, like particularly the Delta variant down in the bottom right here. We worry a lot about the Delta variant in people who have not had that vaccine. You see the difference with the Delta variant once we're And if you just look in green here, those are the people who didn't, who had COVID and recovered. There are some antibody levels, especially 42 days post. The first 3 months after you've had a vaccine, I think the protection's quite good. But you start looking out, you get to 220 days post a vaccine, and the median here is all the way back down to the level that you're less likely to be protected. Whereas in purple here, after the vaccine, those folks who had both are really much more protected. So that's why I make that recommendation, knowing that the vaccine is safe. Knowing that it boosts it. And there are some different types of immunity, different versions that you get from the natural infection and the COVID vaccine. But I don't want people thinking, oh, let me just wait then. Let me just get COVID and take my chances with COVID, because the problem is these are only people who recovered from COVID, right? Unfortunately, there's 700,000 people in the US who did not recover. It's not fully predictable. And if people have questions, I'm happy to talk about some of that research too. But there's much more variability in terms of the immune response for people with a natural infection who have recovered than there is from a vaccine. And then the last thing I wanted to just highlight on this is that there still are a lot of people who are entirely COVID susceptible here in Chicago, about 28% of the population, which is about 750,000 people. And let me just kind of talk you through this. So we study here in Chicago what's called the seroprevalence, which is where we're looking at the blood of people who are not going to get a COVID test. We have blood for some other reason. They're giving blood, they're getting their blood taken for other reasons. And in an anonymous way, we're actually looking to see what percentage of the population in each age group has some protection against COVID. You can look at different antibody types to see whether that is from vaccine or from natural infection. And so these are estimates, to be very clear. So we don't know there's exactly 750,000 people. And there's some details at the bottom if you want to see the footnotes. But basically, for example, in people 0 to 11, we already estimate that about half of Chicago children have already been exposed to COVID and have some level of protection. You see 0% of them have that from vaccination. So 45% of them we think have some infection, but that still means more than half of them are susceptible. And then as that number goes down, we see it change. But overall, unfortunately, we're certainly making progress, but 751,000 Chicagoans not yet been exposed, not either the safer way through learning the lesson of your immune system or through natural infection. So I hope that helps kind of answer your question a little bit. For the person who wrote in, if you just had COVID in the last 3 months, I would consider you really pretty protected. If it were me, I would still get that COVID vaccine because I know then my protection is so much higher. But if it's been in the 3 months, you're unlikely to get COVID again in that time frame. Once we're getting past that time frame, though, especially with the Delta or with other types, again, personally, I would recommend definitely getting the vaccine. That's what I recommend to my friends and family that have had COVID. All right, so let's go in and take some more of your questions. All right. Margot Snyder on Facebook is asking, is it okay to get the booster shot and the flu shot at the same time? It is. So early on in COVID, we made the recommendation that you not get your COVID shot at the same time as any other vaccine because we were still learning about side effects, wanted to make sure we weren't seeing anything unexpected. But at this point, where almost half of the world's population has gotten a COVID vaccine, and there have been many more studies, you absolutely can get your COVID shot and your flu shot at the same time. I'm actually planning to do that this coming Saturday, and you can separate them if you want to, but that's true for any vaccine. So can you get the booster shot and the shingles vaccine at the same time? Yes. Can you get the booster shot and the HPV vaccine? Yes, you can get those at the same time. Can you get your first dose of the Pfizer shot, and can your child get the meningitis vaccine at the same time? Yes. There is no need to separate COVID vaccine doses from any other vaccine dose at this point. Trader Johnny 5 from Twitter says, at this point, we know vaccination doesn't prevent transmission. Why do you keep saying vaccination rates will end the pandemic? So vaccination does not completely prevent transmission, but it is by far the most important thing that helps prevent transmission. And that's because, remember, no vaccine is 100% protective. But even at the beginning here, where these vaccines were about 90% protective, with Delta, if we're getting into the 80, even the 75% protective, even while they remain very protective against severe illness, you cannot spread COVID unless you get infected with COVID. So vaccination is definitely the most important thing. And then even if somebody is infected with COVID and they've been vaccinated, the length of time that they could potentially spread COVID is shorter, and they are less likely, therefore, to spread it, even if in case they do get it. And so one way or another, we're going to get through the population here, I think, frankly. We're not going to eradicate COVID. And so we've got, like I said, about 750,000 people here that one way or another are going to likely learn that immune system lesson. And so either are going to get vaccinated or are going to take their chances with COVID disease. And given for older people, right, the risk of getting seriously ill. For younger people, less likely to get seriously ill. But we are still seeing, almost a third of people who get COVID are still having some kind of symptoms that they think might be tied to COVID 3 months later. Some still don't have their sense of smell or taste back. Some still have fatigue. We're still learning a lot about that long COVID. And we know that there are not long-term side effects from the vaccine. There aren't safety concerns. And so I worry about people who are just saying, I'm going to take my chances with getting the virus, because there are people who take those chances and it doesn't go very well. The last thing is that people who, quote, have natural immunity, meaning they've got some level of protection, are the ones who recovered from COVID, right? We don't have that data for people who died typically. And so could there be something different, even in that immune response? There could. And my only goal is just to help keep you from getting sick and people in your family. And Aaron from Twitter is kind of following up. In your opinion, will COVID, the disease, be endemic for the rest of our lives? Will everyone eventually get COVID? And if so, why the continuing mask requirement? So I don't know for sure what's going to happen with COVID for the rest of our lives. I think it's certainly going to be around for a number of years. If you look at prior pandemics, especially the influenza pandemic from 1918, it took about 4 years for most of, for that pandemic to really die out. Now that's before vaccine, that's before oxygen, that's before a lot of treatments were available, but it did take that amount of time for really most of the world to have been exposed. And the reason for the continuing mask mandate has to do especially with the fact that we still have a lot of people who are not yet vaccinated. We have a lot of children who have not yet been eligible for vaccine. We have a lot of people who are immunocompromised, and I worry about those folks because in that group, the vaccine is not as effective, right? I shared with you last week the very few cases that we've had of people who have had breakthrough deaths, meaning they were fully vaccinated and yet died from COVID. They definitely tend to be older. The median age is 78, but the huge number of them are severely immunocompromised, active cancer, just post transplant. These are folks, unfortunately, who are really dependent on us getting to a point where most of the population is no longer able to spread COVID. And so the mask does help protect others. That's really the main thing that it's doing. Once we are able to get, especially those 5 to 11-year-olds vaccinated, I think that will decrease people's risk and worry about it. But here's the thing. There are countries that have basically vaccinated their entire eligible population, and they're done. They have dropped COVID restrictions. You look at Portugal, virtually everybody's vaccinated. They haven't had this hesitancy like we've seen here. They've not seen problems with side effects. They've not seen long-term issues. And 98, 99% of their eligible folks are vaccinated, they're done, right? There are Scandinavian countries, there's no more masks, there's no more anything. And I just want us to get to that point. Getting to that point means not giving COVID the chance to spread. And when you're vaccinated, you're doing the most important thing in terms of keeping COVID from spreading. And then wearing that mask is the second most important thing that helps limit that risk, given that it is possible for you to carry COVID even if you're vaccinated and not know it. That's been one of the hardest things with this all along, even though your risk is lower than if you're vaccinated. So while we remain in that substantial or high risk, the CDC continues to make the recommendation for keeping those masks on. I want to see those numbers down. I want to take all of our masks off too. Of course I do. I want to be done with COVID. But even more, I want to keep everything open. I want to keep the schools open. I want to keep the businesses open. We've not put any restrictions since fully reopening Chicago back, 6 months ago. Not once has the city of Chicago said, you can't hold this event, you can't have this activity happen, you can't do something. There have been, as you know, sometimes requirements, especially for larger events, for vaccination or negative test. We certainly are supportive of all of the places that are requiring vaccination. I went to the theater this last weekend. Everybody was vaccinated. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable to be in that setting. I've got my vaccine, I've got my mask on, and I'm back at the theater, And so, would it be even nicer to not have to have a mask? It would. But do I care more about all of that coming back, meaning jobs, meaning the things we love in life? I do. And so for right now, again, there's a statewide mask mandate, and I'm hopeful that that's not going to be long term. Getting the kids vaccinated and having that opportunity is going to be a big part of that. But given sort of the choices here, I mostly want us open and I want us safe. And so this isn't going to be forever, because as you say, one way or the other, people are going to be exposed. But until we've had the opportunity for folks to get vaccinated, or until we can get back down to that more controlled place, and we were there over the summer, we can get there again. We will continue to recommend the masks indoors. Question about the travel advisory. So because of the holiday yesterday, the CDC actually delayed updating its numbers, and so we're delaying updating ours, but I am doing a press conference tomorrow, and so we'll be sharing an updated travel advisory at that time. CEO Martinez from CPS will also be on with me. We'll be continuing to be providing some of the CPS and child updates for people who had those questions. Mary Kay on Facebook is asking, can people who receive Moderna, both shots, get the Pfizer as a booster? So if you got Moderna, both shots, very, very soon here, we are going to have guidance for you on boosters. The FDA, later this week, the 14th and the 15th, I think that's Thursday and Friday, will be looking at the data for Moderna and for J&J for the first time related to boosters. And I believe they're also going to start looking, there's been this study going on of crossover vaccine, exactly this question. If I got one dose, for my first round, say I got J&J the first time and Pfizer as a booster. If I got Moderna as a booster, and I mean Moderna is the original and Pfizer as a booster. All of those combinations. There's been a study actually going on for that, and we've been interested to see that data. So I've heard the FDA may start looking at that as soon as this week. So we'll have more guidance for you, but please, my recommendation at this point is to continue to follow the recommendations of the FDA. That's what we have. That's what we have data on, right? That's, you know, the data that I was showing you just now. That's where I feel the most confident in terms of being able to give those recommendations. Please rest assured that the Moderna and the J&J, I think it's likely there will be boosters recommended, just what we've been seeing, but those vaccines came out later than the Pfizer did. And so part of the reason that this is the stage at which we're seeing is you got to collect the data and, you know, have that information to be able to make the right recommendation. It's possible they may recommend a different dose for a Moderna booster. The Moderna vaccine actually had a slightly higher dose of the mRNA. So there's still a few questions, and I would encourage you to hang on just a little bit longer, and we'll have some specific guidance for you with some real data around it starting as soon as this week. So probably beginning next week, I'll be able to go over some of that with you, and those are available to the public if you want to see the actual deliberations. Namrata Batra says, my zip code data is only updated until the October 2nd. How do I get the most updated results? So some of this probably has to do, again, we don't update the dashboard Saturdays, Sundays, or yesterday. And for those zip code data, it gets updated once a week. And there actually is about a 4 to 5 day delay on that because we wait for all of the test results to be reported. We want to really make sure we're reflecting sort of the truth of what's happening in that zip code. So hang tight. Today, Tuesdays are typically the day, I believe, that we're doing that update is usually up. So you should see that coming in. But always, if you look closely, you'll see there's a little bit of a lag because if I just shared like today, what is our rate today? We get most of our test results don't get reported the exact day they get taken. They start to come in the next day. And so there's always a little bit of a lag in the data that we show. And you can, if you click on the footnotes on our dashboard, you'll be able to see the details of what that looks like. But yeah, the zip codes we're updating once a week. Emil on Facebook is asking, does my mask protect me even if no one else is wearing one? Protecting you a bit. It depends a little bit what kind of mask you're wearing. If you are wearing a mask that fits very well, that has a, sort of a good seal, certainly people who are wearing, for example, I know that some of you are wearing the N95s and the KN95s that have a little bit of a tighter seal, probably get a somewhat higher level of protection than people who are just wearing, one of the cloth masks. But I wear cloth masks. The most important thing is, as you say, it's mainly keeping your germs in. And so having everybody around you wearing that mask is the part that helps protect you. And that's one of the things about masks. Like when you wear it, you are primarily protecting others. They are primarily protecting you. But even with the cloth mask, and we've shown data on this, there certainly is some protection there because most COVID is still spread like it has been all along, by droplets. It's just that some of the aerosols of the people around you are not wearing masks could be more likely to spread. So part of the reason for that indoor mask requirement is just that the masks help the most when everybody is wearing them while we remain at these higher level of COVID. Ken Bruce on Facebook, how do I explain a drop in cases and deaths? Let me just see this here. Following hundreds of football stadiums packed with maskless screaming fans over the last 6 weeks. So I'm not sure if you're talking about in Chicago or nationally, but what I can say is that outside is important, right? We've been saying all along, I've been saying probably for a year or more, when you're considering your COVID risk, right? The number one thing is everybody who you're getting together with vaccinated. The number two thing, what is the mask? The number three thing, can you keep your distance? The number four thing is, are you outside? And so at least here in Chicago, I went to the Bears game when they were playing in person, not yesterday, but last weekend. And it was the first time I'd been back to a game I had my mask on when I was going through the lines just because I'm a little bit extra careful. But when I was, when I was in the stands and reasonably spaced, and I knew the people sitting right around me in my party were vaccinated, I did not have a significant concern for COVID. I am also, of course, vaccinated and being careful with it. So at the national level, we've seen Delta do an absolute number on many, many, many states here. We've been reasonably lucky to dodge most of that, but we still have rates of COVID cases, COVID hospitalization, COVID deaths that are less than half the national average. And in terms of deaths, less than a sixth still what we've been seeing across the country, or at least that's where it was last week. And so I think where people, again, if they weren't vaccinated, that 3 months, back to this question of sort of if I survived, for people who did get COVID and survived, or who have been vaccinated, that first 3 months, Delta's unlikely to get them again. And so some of that is probably related to getting through the Delta surge, just unfortunately with a lot of unnecessary cases and deaths. And there's no way in the world I'd be going to a game, if I were not vaccinated. My young nephews, et cetera, not going to big games like that, particularly if there's not a masking component in place. So that's what I would say. And the other thing is, we still are learning all about COVID, right? But outside, clearly important, and vaccination clearly important as well. All right, we are just about at time. Let me see. Aaron on Twitter is asking about this Bangladesh study that surgical masks produced a benefit, that cloth masks didn't have a benefit. So I actually talked about the Bangladesh study on this program back about a month ago. And I'd refer you back to that if you want to take a look at it. What it actually showed, this was where there was a natural study that was done between putting masks in place at a village level versus villages where there was no masking available. And the case of the surgical masks, did specifically produce the benefit. For protecting yourself, KN95s if you're going to wear something, but people often, or an N95, but those have the very tight seal. People often have trouble keeping those on. And so if everybody is wearing a cloth mask, and in the Bangladesh study, everybody was not. That's the other thing. So it was a village-wide intervention, and they showed that they were able to increase it by more than 40% when people were wearing the mask. Surgical masks are good, and I like surgical masks because those are the disposable ones. They're often blue. You can buy a 50 pack for about $13 at this point. Those are what are available on the buses and the CTA. They're good for being disposable. But my most important thing is that people have a mask they will actually keep on. And I think for kids in particular, having a mask that's comfortable while they're in school and the biggest difference is wearing one, frankly. And I hope we're not going to need them very long term, but different people have different levels of comfort with the different masks. So I'd refer you back to where we talked about the Bangladesh study, but it was one of the real world examples that showed that masking actually does have an improvement at the population level. Okay. All right. So I think, given time, we're gonna stop here with questions. I have to correct this though. So Chen Jufao Po on Twitter says CDC just announced the vaccine doesn't stop transmission. So the vaccine does not 100% stop transmission, and it never has, but it is the most important thing that decreases your risk of getting COVID. You cannot spread COVID if you are not infected with COVID. And separate from that, if you are vaccinated and you get a breakthrough infection, the time that you could even potentially spread COVID is less than for people who are unvaccinated. And so I just want to kind of put a point on that. The vaccine, if the vaccine 100% stopped transmission, we have no vaccine that 100% stops COVID. we'd be completely even more done here than we are. But it is the most important tool that we have. That with the mask, with the Delta, remains the most important. And highlighting this, that more people died under Biden than Trump, I'm not interested in who's politically in charge. I'm interested in doing everything we can to protect ourselves against COVID. The COVID vaccine was developed under President Trump. The COVID vaccine was deployed under President Biden. I don't care who's in charge, honest to God, I really don't. I care about saving people's lives. And it worries me when the U.S. has fallen to more than 50, there are more than 50 countries now that are more vaccinated than the U.S. And those countries are the ones that are getting past COVID. Their death rates are almost nothing. Their hospitalization rates are almost nothing. They're totally open. And it's all I want. I don't care about the politics. I want us to be open, and I want people to be able to put this whole thing behind us. Some of you are going to take your chances with getting COVID. Please try to avoid that. I want the hospitals available for people who are needing them for non-COVID reasons. I'm worried as we head into flu and winter season. And for those of you who are still thinking about it, or if you know people who are still thinking about it, boy, the safety data is good. And if you've got safety questions, please send them in. There's not been a single side effect issue yet that we've looked at that isn't much, 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 much worse in people who get COVID than in people who get the vaccine. No pregnancy concerns, no fertility concerns. I still got people writing in saying you're more likely to die after you get the COVID vaccine. Could not be less true. Unfortunately, the risk is so much greater among those who are not vaccinated. So I don't know. I just share the studies that I read and share with you the data that I use when I make the recommendations. This is Chicago data. It's about our risk right here, and that's where I keep my focus. So I will, with that, sign off. We will be on Thursday again. And we've still got some more people with some questions about transmission and immunity. I'm happy to pull up some more studies related to that. If you want to send me any studies that you'd like me to talk about specifically, more than happy to do this. This is not a fight between natural immunity and vaccine. That's why I showed the study that I showed. People who are lucky enough to recover from COVID have some level of protection, but it's not as good as the people who are vaccinated. And the people who have the best protection of everybody are the people who both have recovered and have had a vaccine. The people I'm most worried about are the people who have not had COVID nor had a vaccine, those 750,000 people in Chicago. We will be back on Thursday to take more of your questions, and thank you so much.